Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and we are here today to talk more about the Central Penn College film series. And we are being joined by Mark Hunsberger. He's an adjunct faculty member here at Central Penn College, but also his day job is the Director of Education and Youth Symphony Administrator for the Harrisburg Symphony Orchestra. He's going to be facilitating the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and he's got something very special planned for fans of the film series. So, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So mainly what we want to do is focus today on your upcoming April 26th CPC film series of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now, of all the films that we've done to this point, this might be one that maybe the audience isn't quite as familiar with. This film comes from the 1920s and is a German silent horror film. It is considered the quintessential work of German expressionist cinema and tells the story of an insane hypnotist who uses sleepwalking to commit murders. Sounds like fun. So I guess the very first question is, why did you pick this particular film?
So it's actually the reason I chose it is because I've never had a chance to do a live score for this one. I had done, the most recent one I did was a comedy movie that featured Buster Keaton called The General. And that was a cool experience. And then when the opportunity presented itself to host film as part of this series, I thought about the musicians I'd like to use and what they bring to the table musically. It would be a really cool context to create music within. And so that was kind of it. And I mean, I enjoy the film in and of itself, but obviously I was kind of, I don't want to say limited, but to do the live score, I obviously wanted to choose films that didn't have music to begin with.
Well, and you kind of gave a little spoiler there because one of the most unique things about this particular Central Penn College film series is that you are going to be doing a live score, a live soundtrack along with the film. Why is this? I mean, obviously you're a musician, so this is right up your alley. But where did this come from? So you've obviously done this before. Where did you get the idea to do a live score to accompany a silent film?
It was actually when I've done this before, I was actually a part of an event that other people had organized. So I was kind of a hired gun, so to speak. They wanted to be part of the band, and so when I got connected here with this film, and they asked if I'd like to host one, I said, "Well, would you guys be interested in doing like this kind of live improvised score with a silent film?" And the folks in the humanities department were super into it, as was I, obviously. And so that's kind of how it came together based on past experience. Yeah, so I think the cool thing is it brings together kind of the tradition. So the guys I work with, primarily we play in the jazz context. So we're comfortable with improvising, but usually within the context of a song, where there are some, I guess you could say, a box where you know that certain things fit and there's a certain formula or a pathway that you follow that keeps us all together. And in this context, we're just kind of, we can talk a little bit more about this stuff a little later on, but we're just kind of open to whatever happens. There's no, well, we have to play this when this happens, or we have to do this, or we have to do this. It's a little more open-ended.
Well, you'd mentioned, too, we're just going to take a brief aside here. You'd mentioned, too, about your background in jazz. So one of the classes that you teach here at Central Penn College is a class called The History of Jazz, and that's you've been here for a couple years now teaching that class. I always try to get people into that class and always get a lot of positive feedback about the class. But recently, you have actually added a class to the humanities offerings. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of popular music that ran during the winter term for the first time?
Sure. So I've been here for, actually it'll be 3 years this term.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I had run the history of jazz for a while, and just based off the student reactions and stuff, I mean, obviously I love jazz, and I know there are a lot of people out there that do, but if it's not something you're really into, sometimes the history side of it isn't as engaging, even though I like to think that I make it engaging. Sometimes it's not. And certainly not having a lot of the vocal aspects of it kind of throughout a lot of the stuff we'd listen to, what was something that kind of limited the ability to engage with it. So I just thought, a history of American popular music, or I guess maybe to be more specific, say popular music within the United States, obviously understanding that influences came from outside of the country as well, would be maybe easier for the students to connect with. That's what I was looking for. Is there a way that we can create some content that they would be able to connect with? And so, we basically take a look at, I kind of present some guiding themes that we use to study the music chronologically from right around the Civil War era and then all the way up until present day, and kind of connect it to the realities of the history of our country and all the stuff that comes with it, all of those contexts and influences that had an impact on the music industry.
One of the things that I talk about in my classes is the conglomeration of the media, that the media is really owned by just a relatively few very powerful players in the industry. What impact does that have on maybe modern day popular music, let's say over the past 20 years? What impact does that have on what we hear on the radio, on those quote-unquote pop stations?
Right. I mean, so definitely the consolidation of that stuff had a big impact. And I mean, if you think about the history of it, we're talking about a music industry that, in terms of when it emerged as an actual industry, is pushing about 100 years, give or take, somewhere right around that mark, depending on what you consider the kind of first instance of the industry. And so I think what's actually had an impact a lot is what they do with the data now of what people are listening to. And so I have a friend who works for one of the big record companies in New York City, and he does a lot of analyzing data and that type of stuff to what people are listening to. And they have all these different qualities that they attach to music now. It could be like ambiance, things that we might expect music-wise, like tempo or dynamics or the speed. Speed would be tempo as well. But ambiance, danceability,
Danceability, that's an interesting term.
I've heard that one time. And a lot of this you can actually find if you check out like... I think it's if you go through like Spotify, you can find a lot of these characteristics. And so all these songs get rated on this. And then what happens is, they kind of track, well, what songs were super popular and how can we recreate stuff that has similar qualities, not exactly, but similar, that would ideally be super popular. So in that sense, I think that's a very commercial approach to it, less about, are we creating artistic music as opposed to are we actually just creating something that'll sell. And I guess there could be artistry within that, if they say, well, we're working within these parameters, so let's create something that is meaningful. On the reverse end of that, I guess, what we're doing here with this podcast, the technological developments that enabled like the home studio have now allowed more musicians to put music out and stuff that don't have to go through record labels. They can buy all the equipment, they can do it in their house, or they can rent studio time, and they can produce albums. I was a part of a project with a group out of Chicago that put an album out 2 years ago, and the drums were recorded in my house. We set everything up, and they recorded everything else at their place in Chicago, like in their house. And so we weren't even together as a group when we did it. But that's what modern technology has offered.
I think that's so unique. That's so awesome that kind of creativity can still happen in a different way. And we've talked about that on this podcast before. What's interesting about this is we would have never been able to do something like this in terms of the budget and the money that we've put into this even 15 years ago. We would have had to gotten a license and we would have had to pay lots and lots of money for equipment. Now we've been able to fundraise for this, and now we're able to produce a podcast that can be heard all over the world by any of our students or faculty or staff, and I think that's really unique. A final question before we move on to talking a little bit more about the CPC film series. So from my perspective, in radio, that's where I began my career. I spent about 6 years in the radio business, both on campus, and then I went to work for a station called WLER in Butler and loved my time. But one of the issues that I have with radio in the modern day is that it is so centralized, and it's really all nationwide. There's such a limited opportunity for local artists to get any airplay at all, and if they get airplay, to have any traction on that airplay. What impact do you think that has on local musicians and their ability to take that next step beyond working, your bar and club scene at a local level?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say, from my experience at least, that I don't know that looking at radio play is necessarily a part of the pathway that the musicians now that at the local level that aren't dealing, on a huge level with the backing of some label or something like that, they can help them get to that. I don't know that that's necessarily a route that they're all looking at now, or that necessarily it's a viable part of the pathway anymore to being successful. I would say that with kind of the way radio has changed, especially now that, music is streamable. So you can, you can buy a subscription, pay $10-12 a month, and whatever you want to have access to that's on those platforms, you have access to. I don't think that because of the accessibility of that radio is necessarily a route that, at least the musician friends that I have, that's not a route that they think about. Now, some of the folks who do, there are a few of my mentors who are jazz musicians who are based kind of in the Philly area but travel all over the country and in the world playing. And they're obviously older than I am. They're more established. But they have record labels that their recordings are part of, and their stuff ends up on radio stations, whether it's some local stuff or like WBGO that's coming out of New Jersey, that type of stuff that focuses more so on the jazz side of things. So I know in that context they're looking for that just once they have an album, so to speak. But I don't think anyone's, at least in my perception, looking at it anymore as hey, if we can get on the radio, that's our shot to make it big. I think the pathways might be different now.
And I fully concur with that, especially with the ease of self-distribution, whether that be through SoundCloud, CD Baby, or any of the other methods, iTunes, etc. But by that same token, how do fans then even understand that somebody's out there? How do they know without being close personal friends of them or maybe having someone make a recommendation? The radio has always been a way to kind of at least present the type of music to people. If they don't have that now, it's just there's hundreds of thousands of bands out there. How are they ever really going to stumble across it?
Yeah, maybe it has to be. Maybe the listener needs to be someone who's intent on trying to find some new stuff, or maybe it's possible through, a lot of these devices now have the shuffle option where, if you're listening to something in a certain artist and you let it go to shuffle or whatever, they call it radio, but they basically curate, whatever algorithms they use, stuff that you can listen to that's similar to what you've been listening to. And obviously that's limited only to those folks who are on those platforms, but a lot of them are now. Maybe that's a way to get there. I also think something that's interesting that maybe not, we don't have time for a whole discussion on, but just to mention as we talk about how the industry's changed is you start to see, especially if you look at, I use Spotify. That's the one that I use almost primarily. And while I know it's not the greatest deal for the artist, I still actually buy records, like legitimate records. I do buy CDs, but like legitimate.
Well, and vinyl's making a comeback as well.
It is. I'm usually looking for the older stuff though, when jazz was still coming out on vinyl. But a lot of the music now is almost geared towards connected to activities. So if you go online, if you pull up Spotify, you can find playlists for countless things. So the music, as we talk about in the class, that type of listening would be passive listening, where you're not really paying attention to it, but you want it on for ambiance or whatever. So an example would be, you can find tons of playlists that are designed for working out. They could have tons of different names. You can find them for, like chill lists if you're like, I just want to hang out with my friends, or if I want to go to sleep, or if I want to study. Like they have all these different playlists, if party playlists, if you're like, I just want music that, we're going to have people over and it'll be a good time. And I think that's an interesting trend that people are thinking about that. I actually know some folks who have created music specifically to be featured in those playlists, because you can make a living, or at least somewhat of addition to your living, doing that type of stuff, but you kind of just study, okay, again, without going into the depths of it, you're kind of listening to and trying to interpret, okay, well, what are those qualities that people listen to this for? And can I create something that's similar to that? And then if you're lucky enough to get in that kind of playlist rotation, well, in some cases you can get paid up front for the work, and then eventually you can collect royalties off of it. So it may not be a ton because the streaming services aren't necessarily the best deal in that regard, but it's just such a different way to get in. Like you're creating music for an event or a specific time, as opposed to creating music, kind of what we think of as the artistic side of it, right? So, I've been checking out, it'd be like if we sat down and we're like, hey, we want to create a bunch of music that's specifically designed for people to work out to. And we just listened to workout playlists, and then we said, hey, okay, we're going to try and write like 10 or 12 songs and get them up on these playlists and start to get some plays.
That's so interesting. I'm a fan of music. I've never been a musician myself, but I think it's very interesting and unique to talk about how modern musicians have sort of, gotten around the idea that there's just no local flavor to the music that's being played. I mean, even I remember when I grew up in this area, bands like, and I know we're just getting us slightly off topic here, but bands like Fuel, really got their start around here in this area, and they even said early on that they weren't even from here. They came to this area because it was very well known for the local music support that people in this area gave. So I think it's very insightful about how music's changed and how musicians are changing with it. Well, let's come back to why you're really here to talk about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Again, Mark Hunsberger's CPC film series will be the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That'll be on April 26th. It'll start at 6:30 in the Capital BlueCross Theatre, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that from the Nightly News. So we talked a little bit about why you selected the film, but I wanted to point out that you are going to be improvising this live soundtrack. You said that you're not really necessarily boxed in to anything specifically, but when you say improvise, I mean, to me, that's like, okay, you're coming in with basically no practice, no rehearsal. Is that what you guys are going to do? You're just going to come in and sit down, or you guys are going to be working something out in the background?
So it'll be kind of similar to what you just described. So my plan is to essentially come up with, for some of the different characters or maybe the themes running through the film, to come up with some short ideas that I'll have basically just on one sheet of paper for the musicians who are there. And those will essentially be like, I guess you could say nuggets or little sketches. And the idea, while I won't say that I'm necessarily borrowing from this because I know it could be termed other things, but there's a term in classical music called leitmotif, Leitmotif. And it's connected a lot with the opera tradition of taking a specific melody or idea and associating it with a character. And then that comes back over and over in different ways throughout the performance, connected to that character. Or maybe it's a theme. It could be a melody connected to a theme about love, or one connected to a theme about death, And so my thought was to kind of take that concept and create, a few little nuggets for these characters. And then the plan is that we're going to, I'll give the other guys in the band will have the film ahead of time so they can take a watch of it. And then the plan is that we'll get together and just do one run through with the stuff so they can get comfortable with the film if they haven't had a chance to kind of watch it as in depth beforehand. Also kind of get comfortable with some of the material I presented. And then, the reality is that rehearsal will be completely different than the actual show, because it's kind of, okay, we'll hear these little ideas and then we can do whatever we want with them. And the intent is that they're not played the same way every time.
Now, how long is the film?
It's about 80-ish minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what does that present any problems? That's a long time to, are you going to be playing straight through, or are there going to be spots where you're stopping and maybe regrouping, or are you just going to play for 80 straight minutes?
Any good musician would say that silence is a very important part of the music. And so I'm hopeful that that'll work itself in there, whether that means that we're all silent or that we understand that, maybe sometimes just one of the instruments is enough, and we don't all have to play at the same time or all have to start and stop at the same time. But yeah, the intent is that we'll be, playing the entire length of the film. What I think is interesting about doing it this way, so, if you think back when silent films were the rage, before we had the development of technology to put sound with it, a lot of times if you went to see a movie, there would be a pianist in the theater that was improvising to the show. Sometimes people would have written stuff out as well, but a lot of times they would be improvising. So if you went to see this movie here in Harrisburg and then went to see the movie in Lancaster, the reality is that you would probably have different music for each of those experiences. And so the idea was, let's take that kind of tradition and instead of just having a pianist, expand it to a trio. So we'll have piano, bass, and drums, and then kind of open that up and see what happens. And so that's kind of it kind of brings together that cool tradition within the film, the film context, as well as, the jazz side of things where I certainly feel most at home.
So in previous CPC film series, there's about a 30-minute presentation ahead of time. Are you going to be talking about the cabinet or maybe better question is, what specifically are you going to be talking about in that opportunity before the film?
Sure. So I'll probably give just a brief overview so that folks know that I think what's beautiful about the film is that it is kind of unsettling in certain ways if you allow yourself to kind of be brought into that environment. And I'm going to encourage them and say, hey, for the next 80, 90 minutes, just be in this space that this film puts you in, because the way it's designed with kind of all of the angular offset stuff that kind of makes you feel uneasy. It's done with intent to kind of bring you into this weird world, and then the twist ending, which we won't give away, is what kind of at the end, if you make that connection, you're like, oh, so what's what's really reality. Like that's kind of one of the cool twists in the film. And then aside from that, I think I'm going to talk about the process I just kind of outlined. You know, how did I come up with these little themes? Hopefully I can play some of them, or maybe show them what we're going to be using and say, hey, you know, so you're going to hear an hour and 20 minutes worth of improvised music. Maybe sometimes it'll be sound, you know, maybe we'll just be like trying to create effects to go with whatever's going on or something. But here's what we're starting with. And, you know, it's kind of this one page with some black dots or some words on it or letters on it or something, you know, and that's what we're using.
To me, I think that's the most interesting part about all this, because speaking from somebody who, again, I'm a fan of music, but I've never really played music, to learn more about how you go through the creation of something like this. Because, look, I'm sure if I sat down and I wanted to learn a real quick, easy Green Day song or something, it probably wouldn't take me a whole lot to figure out. No disrespect to Green Day, they're a band that's destined for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but by nature their music's relatively simplistic. But my point is I think to sit down and play something is one thing if it's not your own, but to be able to create something like this, I just think it's so insightful. And for me personally, I'm being selfish here, but I think that's what would be so interesting to the audience, is understanding not only where this came from, but the development of it as well. So I think that's something that's going to be really cool. Well, one thing we were talking about off air is that this film really does have some amazing, you know, it has such a legacy. In fact, notorious film critic Roger Ebert called it arguably the first true horror film, and it also very heavily influenced genres of horror and film noir, which is actually what I did my presentation about with The Big Lebowski. So a lot of those techniques kind of started with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, really influenced film going forward. As someone who's obviously a fan of this film, what importance do you think that this film had in film history?
Well, I can speak from that personally. I'm by no means a film history
of course
expert, so I won't you know, take everything I say with a grain of salt from just my perspective. But I think what it hit on before, and you talked about being a horror film, but the reality, this was one of the first films that kind of introduced that concept of the twist ending, where they present this whole series of events, this whole story, and then at the very end you're just kind of left with this. You're not necessarily given a resolution, right? You're given kind of this, oh wait, so this was really what was happening the whole time. Well then, what am I supposed to know? What am I supposed to believe? Right? You're kind of left. You know, if you follow long enough to catch all of those things, you're kind of left in that space. And I think, you know, I don't know if I can speak to how it influenced films thereafter, but I would think, you know, how interesting was that? You know, you've kind of had this tradition of popular film, whatever it was, by, you know, 1920s, whatever that history was, and then all of a sudden for this kind of new thing to emerge, you know, the first time that happens, you know, and I think about kind of drawing maybe some of those same parallels to music. You know, if you think about, okay, well, what popular songs were like up until the early 1900s, and then eventually we got jazz came on the scene and was influenced by popular dances and dance music of the time, and then eventually we get to the swing era. And then once we get out of the swing era, there's some transitioning going on where vocalists are popular because of some industry struggles that are going on with unions and stuff. And then eventually we arrive at rhythm and blues, country, and then eventually those kind of coming together to form early rock and roll. And, you know, you think about, like, historically what we learn about and how interesting of a time that was within the music industry, or maybe for some folks turbulent, you know, kind of like this new thing is coming out and you have the older people from the older tradition saying, oh, that's nothing, don't go with it. And then you have all these young people who are embracing it. And so I kind of draw those parallels, and I'm like, well, what would that have been like at that time to see a movie like that? And especially because of when it came out, and then the realities that it was a foreign film, but eventually kind of the regulations that existed around the foreign film, I don't want to say industry, but maybe legalities at that time, were lax, which allowed it to come into the United States. Right, so, you know, you're looking at you know, post World War I, and now we're getting this kind of German film that's kind of in some ways off the wall. For me, that's what I think is probably the interesting, and it's hard to grasp that, you know, in the context of what we're doing. You know, you can present that kind of historical reality and say, hey, at the time this came out, nobody had really done something like this. And if they did it, it at least didn't hit this big of a spectrum or large of an audience, so to speak. So for me, that's when I draw those connections to the stuff that I'm, interested in and passionate about on the music side. I'm like, well, what? Just to see this for the first time, you wonder, like, did people just get up and walk out?
It had to be mind blowing, right?
Yeah. Were they just like, what? No, we're just going to walk out of this.
Well, I got to tell you, I really appreciate you spending time with the Nightly News today. This is something that we've really been looking forward to. As soon as I heard this was going to be coming up, I immediately gravitated to it because it's a unique film that, frankly, probably a lot of people have not seen. I think so. And the way that you're embracing this and doing the improvisation of the live soundtrack, I just think is going to be one of the most unique things that we've seen with the CPC film series. So I just want to thank you not only for being on the podcast today, but for really taking this idea and this thing that we've been doing over the past year or so and really running with it and bringing something unique to the table. So I got to thank you so much, Mark, for all of the time that you're going to be putting into this, and certainly for your time here today.
Well, thanks. I mean, I'm glad I get to be part of the series, and thanks to all of you for kind of being open to the suggestion that we could do this film with live music. That'd be interesting. I'm glad that you were open to seeing what would happen.
And we're going to do everything we can to get the word out and get as many people in that Capital BlueCross Theatre on April 26th at 6:30 for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and the live soundtrack featuring Mark Hunsberger and his band. So, Mark, we really look forward to this.
Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Anytime. All right, so for Mark Hunsberger, he's the faculty member here at Central Penn College and the Director of Education and Youth Symphony Advisor for the Harrisburg Symphony Orchestra. This is Professor Paul Miller, and we will catch you next time on the Nightly News Podcast.
This is Grant Ellsworth, Assistant Professor of Humanities at Central Penn College. Thank you for listening to the Nightly News Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Nightly News Podcast. This is Professor Paul Miller, and we're coming here today with one of our most illustrious guests that we've ever had on the podcast. Our political correspondent for the Nightly News, former Senior Deputy Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, John Butchar. John, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Now, how many times does this make on the Nightly News Podcast for you?
Not certain.
I believe it's 3.
3 or 4, perhaps?
I believe it's 3, and I think there were a couple of times where we recorded 2 separate episodes while you were here. So John is now retired and does keep his ear very close to the ground in terms of politics. As I've mentioned before, when John is on, we are not here to give partisan views. We are simply here to provide some observations. And on this particular episode, we're going to talk about what a potential impeachment process looking like. We're not advocating for that to happen, but certainly in many mainstream media outlets, you hear a lot about the potential of this happening. So that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. Where are we with that, and what would need to happen for that to happen, and maybe a little bit more about the process through which impeachment takes place. So we'll be chatting about that here in just a minute. We're also being joined here by Nightly News Vice President Dylan Kleintop. Dylan, thank you very much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure being here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you, that's for sure. Dylan is in my media and politics class in his last couple of terms here at Central Penn College and is very, very active in political discourse, one of the reasons I had him down here today. So we look forward to hearing some of Dylan's comments and questions. We will also wrap up a little bit more. Dylan has a few questions for John that we will end the podcast with. But let's start at the beginning. Now, the first question I have is this. So in our class, we just came from class, we were talking about some of the potential reasons for Trump potentially to be impeached. And the question I asked were, well, what were some of the impeachable offenses that Donald Trump has, carried out in his 2 years in office thus far?
Many, many, many. First of all, the impeachment process is specifically spelled out in the Constitution, and the main criteria in the Constitution are treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which is not further defined and has had over the years quite a few different interpretations. Well, if we look at a recent example of an impeachment, when Bill Clinton was president, he was impeached on 2 issues, perjury and obstruction of justice, and both would be appropriate. Certainly obstruction of justice, I think, has clearly been made in the Trump presidency here. Perjury would certainly, he's been less than truthful with the American public and in most of his Twitter tweets and other things. But whether or not he is guilty of perjury, that has to be under oath before some type of committee. And I can't say that I don't recall yet that he's been in that situation. Other issues to me would look to specifically the Russian investigation of the collusion of the Trump team with Russia. I think his team staff, his handlers, his fixers, and others from before have clearly been involved in the attempt to undermine the democracy, the democratic process in America through interference with the 2016 election. Whether you call that treason, at what point it rises to treason will still be sorted out. We still don't have all the facts. Certainly the Mueller investigation is still out there. But even absent that, the House of Representatives clearly has enough information to move forward on some grounds if they choose.
But the question remains here, and certainly if you read Trump's Twitter feed with any regularity, he continues to say that there is no collusion, that there's never been any collusion found, and that even people within our own government claim that there was no collusion on his end. So where is the middle ground here?
There isn't. Bottom line is collusion is basically fraternization, in this case, with the Russians to try to impact the election. And it's clear that his staff and a whole host of people from the Trump campaign were involved in colluding with the Russians to affect the election. To what extent he personally has, that's yet to be fully fleshed out, and not sure that will be. One of the things that really bothers me is Trump's adopting a friendly, almost flirtatious tone with Vladimir Putin, the head of Russia. It's clear Russia was significantly involved in trying to affect our election, still is with the upcoming election, and Trump denies it because his friend Putin says no.
So with all of this going on, like the impeachment talk and whatnot, do you think Trump still has the ability to win the next election to become president?
Well, that's interesting. He has an entrenched base, and that may be part of it, but may be separate and apart from it. And one thing I do want to mention is the impeachment process is a two-part process, and we'll get into that more in a minute. But impeachment really means bringing an article of impeachment, an attack on an article that suggests or states that the president has done A, B, or C and should be removed from office. So the impeachment part is actually the initial part of impeaching. Just like you can impeach someone's character by saying something negative about them, that's really the way the term is used to start. And only upon conviction will a president be removed from office. And if a president is not removed from office, it may or may not have any impact on his ability to be reelected. Because if he were removed from office, he'd be done. He'd be gone. And if he's not convicted and removed from office, then his followers will believe it was just a witch hunt, as he calls it, and they may very well vote for him again.
Earlier, you had mentioned that, with the collusion with Russia. What are some of the other things that, because you'd mentioned, even in class today, you'd said, when I asked that question, you said, I could start on one side of the wall and come wrap the whole way around the room. What are some examples of some other potentially impeachable offenses that Trump has engaged in so far?
Well, to my mind, his abandoning our allies and embracing our really mortal enemies, North Korea, Russia, etc., really puts into question his loyalties. That really speaks to the treason issue somewhat, because he has denied and will not agree with the findings of 17 different intelligence agencies that have found Russian involvement in our elections. And he simply embraces those who compliment him. He really is I think, a clinical narcissist. And that's how you get on Trump's good side. Our friends and allies around the world who have supported us as we've supported them in countless wars and other situations around the globe for a long time. It's part of their job is when they disagree with what the United States is doing to propose a different path for the civilized world. But Trump doesn't like that. Since if he doesn't agree what they say, well, he sort of discounts them and dismisses them, and we no longer have the free world really looking to the United States to lead. One of the things we've done here is lost, I think, the leadership of the free world under Trump. We may be able to get that back, but maybe not down the road. So it's hard to put an exact number on the things. Certainly the Mueller investigation is going to reveal many other points of contact, and that will lend itself to the House of Representatives writing some articles of impeachment on specific grounds. All right, let me explain this once again. The articles of impeachment arise only in the House of Representatives. So with the last election, the Democrats took over the House of Representatives. Now, the party in power in that House then gets to staff all the committees. They get the chairmanships of all the committees and have increased power to bring issues to the floor of the House and vote on them in the House. If articles of impeachment are written in the House of Representatives, they need only pass by a majority vote to go on to the Senate to be considered and tried as in a... So if the House writes articles of impeachment, they will go on to the Senate, and conviction impeachment hearing will be then held in the Senate. Members of the House of Representatives will act as prosecutors and will bring those charges against Trump, and it's up to the senators to decide if he's guilty enough and done bad enough stuff to be removed from office. And that takes a 2/3 vote of the Senate, which is still, slightly in Republican control. So you not only need to have every Democrat voting for it, but you need a significant number of Republicans to vote for removal from office.
So I asked you this question previously, and it was about, do you think a former president could be sent to prison? And just want to elaborate on that question. You said that basically getting impeached from office is enough, and if they do something outside of getting impeached, like in the public world, then they will be convicted and sent to prison. But do you think a president will ever do something so bad that he does get convicted and sent to prison?
Well, I think it depends on the type of thing it is. You're talking about while in office. I think while in office, if he commits mass murder by shooting everybody in the gallery, that's a different story, a different type of inquiry. And that's where your criminal justice system comes into play. But in terms of actions relating to his official duties, the only thing the Constitution provides is for removal by impeachment. I think the jury is still out, to use a term, on whether or not a president at the same time can be indicted and jailed for a criminal crime while in office. I think that is an open question that's being debated right now because there are many experts who think impeachment is all that can happen. But we'll see.
You'd mentioned earlier the Mueller investigation. This Mueller investigation seemingly has gone on almost since Trump entered office. What is, for lack of a better nomenclature, what's taken so long on getting the report and the findings of this Mueller investigation?
The Mueller investigation has, from their initial findings, expanded exponentially because of what they found at each stage. When they found certain people guilty of, say, trying to affect elections, well, that's led them to other people. That's led them to other aides who may have election fraud issues. And I believe the number is now that 37 of Trump's staff, aides, friends, fixers, have already been indicted or are already on their way to prison. So it has taken a while. 2 years to explore, to investigate, and get to that many indictments is actually pretty fast.
So how can, if all that's true with all the indictments, how can Trump say what he says on Twitter, that there's been no collusion, even though there's already been indictments along those lines?
He may say whatever he wants on Twitter. There's nobody who tells him he can't make up things on Twitter. And if the American public wants to believe his Twitter feeds, that's their prerogative. Whether or not there's a single fact to back up his Twitter feeds is a separate issue.
Well, so we're talking here with former senior Deputy Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, John Butchar. We're talking a little bit more about the impeachment process. So I guess here's my question. based on your discussion about the articles of impeachment, how it would have to go through the House and then receive 2/3 a majority in the Senate for him to be removed from office, why would they do this just knowing that it's not going to happen? You said earlier today there's almost no chance that with a Republican Senate that they would vote to remove Donald Trump from president. And you even talked about some of the previous cases with Bill Clinton specifically, how they only even received just a small percentage of the vote to remove him from office. What's the point in holding up and tying up our House of Representatives to proceed with this if it's just going to die in the Senate when really their time could be spent trying to make other changes?
Well, that's a good point, but you could use the same argument for any law that's passed that goes on for ages back and forth to try to accomplish a certain law, and it never makes it through. So the process itself, I think, is important. I think the bringing out the facts to the American people is important. It could affect the next election, and certainly there's a political angle to it as well, because now the Democrats have the majority in the House. So they are now for the first time able to bring articles of impeachment. Before, even under the same set of facts, before this prior election when the Republicans were the majority in the House, they were in charge of all the committees. They had the majority share of all the committees. So they really controlled what legislation or what bills of any kind would make it to the floor for a vote. So even under the same facts with the Republicans in charge, as long as Donald Trump is promoting their agenda, there was no, except for some very, very morally high-minded individuals, there's no incentive for the Republicans to, in the Judiciary Committee where it would start, to write up an article of impeachment to move forward.
Well, we are coming to the close here on this segment of the podcast. I do want to save a couple of minutes here for Dylan. I just had one final question about the going into the 2020 election. Let's say the articles of impeachment pass in the House and they go to the Senate. What impact do you think that has on the election? Any?
I think it will have some. To what extent, I have no idea. I mean, the 2016 election surprised me a great deal.
You and a lot of other people, for sure.
I hadn't factored in the Russians kind of stealing 3 states for the Republican Party in that regard. But it's hard to say. There's certainly an entrenched base who believes Trump's position that I'm for the security of America, let's build a wall, and the Democrats are for allowing criminals in and let's kill everybody. The Democrats are for letting the criminals run the country. Not true from my perspective, but there's certainly a good number of people who support Trump because he's a maverick, because he's not doing things the traditional way here.
Interesting. All right. Well, so we've talked about the impeachment process somewhat to give you a little bit of knowledge on how that might unfold over the course of, would you say, the next 6 months before we see articles of impeachment? Maybe less, maybe more?
I think there's enough fodder for the House of Representatives to start writing articles of impeachment as we sit here today. However, I'm sure they would like to, they're still holding hearings and they've got hearings scheduled, and I'm sure they'd love to see the Mueller report come down first, because that will add a lot of ammunition to whatever they're going to do, and that will disclose things that they will not otherwise find without it.
And John, when we have you back again in the future, we will continue to talk about this issue because it's probably something that's going to be ongoing for potentially the next 6 years. So, all right. Well, Dylan, I wanted to give you a chance to chat with John about some of his career. So just to give you a little bit of background, and please correct me if I misspeak here, John, but as I mentioned, John, former senior deputy attorney general, you worked in tax litigation at the state level, and you spent 30 years working with the state of Pennsylvania. You've argued in front of the Supreme Court, and you actually went as far in class today as say that your record in front of the Supreme Court, a sterling 22-0. So that's very, very impressive that you have that record in front of our Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. So I wanted Dylan to have the opportunity to ask some questions and learn a little bit more about your history.
Before class today, I didn't exactly know. I knew what an attorney general was, but I didn't know exactly what an attorney general did. So most of these questions are going to be for people that probably have the same questions that I did before class today. One of the biggest questions that I want to ask you is, what was the toughest thing that you had to do in your working career? Like the toughest issue that you faced?
Well, what I was doing was, as I said, doing tax litigation. So to me, there was no heart-wrenching issues. There's no personal liberty on the line or things like that. It's myself litigating against Texaco and Walmart and the major corporations of the world as to how Pennsylvania taxes are applied to them and whether the formulas are unconstitutional. So none of that was difficult in doing that. I think my biggest difficulty was that the courts will not tolerate you litigating every case. For every case that gets filed in court, an enormous percentage of those are settled. If it's just a money issue, you find a way to settle it. You may go back and forth several times, but you find a way to settle it. It's only when a broader constitutional or statutory issue comes into play that really needs to be decided by the court that you move forward with full litigation. My bigger problem, rather than the litigation, because I always had the full support of my office in litigation, was in the settlement process of cases. There we had to involve the Department of Revenue because all these cases arose in the Department of Revenue. And of course, the Department of Revenue believes if they are applying a tax a certain way, it had to be right. Well, that might have been so, or it may have been borderline unconstitutional when you look at the U.S. Constitution, or maybe completely unconstitutional. So settling those cases was always a challenge. Some cases went easily, but others had a lot of pushback from the department. We had to get to the point where, the upper echelon had to get together, Attorney General, Secretary of Revenue kind of thing.
And John, just to chime in here, one of the things you said in class today, one of the most difficult parts of your job, was the fact that you were dealing with such a specialized industry, and most of the Supreme Court justices had no clue what you were talking about in many instances.
Oh, that's very true. In any really specialized area of law, remember, judges and justices are elected in Pennsylvania, and they generally have a broad knowledge or maybe in a certain area, but it's rarely something as technical as corporate tax litigation or insurance tax litigation. So you really have to distill it down to the real basics so they understand what the underlying issue is before you can convince them, how the U.S. Constitution affects that case.
I just have two more questions. So who does the state attorney general, who do you directly work with?
All right, well, the state attorney general is the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Pennsylvania. He is elected as a sovereign official to run the office of attorney general. Under the attorney general's office, there is a criminal division and a civil division. The criminal division does just what you think it do. It does, chases drug lords and does all kinds of stuff and does stings with local municipalities and other agencies. And the civil division is where I worked, and we had several different branches. In my case, it was the tax litigation section. But each section really becomes expert in its own area. So we're not generalists. We become very expert in our particular area. And you have to remember that every judge or justice does not come from the same background. Does not come with the same understanding, and you have to help them through the process. We have seen cases where the court has just plain got it wrong in either direction, just misunderstood something so completely that when the decision came out, everybody read the decision and said, oops, well, that's just not right. Not just the decision, but the underlying basis for the decision.
Now, let me ask you a question. In terms of the Attorney General, you'd mentioned the Attorney General is elected. You were never elected to any office. How did the different Attorney Generals that came in and out of the office over your 30 years change the different initiatives and the different types of cases that you worked on?
Didn't. Really what you have, the elected Attorney General is there to oversee the office, and they have, they come with their certain ideas, like maybe they want to focus on RICO, on racketeering investigations or something like that. And that's something then that part of the criminal section will do. But they really have the different sections, we're defense lawyers. The attorney generals are defense lawyers. So we don't bring the cases. We defend the cases that are brought through the system from whatever agency of the Commonwealth has a dispute with a taxpayer, whether it be a corporation, an individual, whatever, a bank, an insurance company, and then our job is to defend that law in Pennsylvania. So the Attorney General himself or herself really has very little input or day-to-day involvement with the particular cases like that. As I said, I had a couple juggle 250 cases at all times.
Which I still find unbelievable. You could be juggling 250 cases at any given time.
So at any given time, just tax litigation section might have 12 or 1,300 active cases going on at a given time. And Attorney General, the only ones that he would even want to know anything about would be the largest cases that would have fallout from major corporations in play or something or other.
Dylan, you have one more question.
Yep. 30 years ago, I probably would have asked you this question, and you probably wouldn't have had the answer for it. But since social media is now such a big thing, especially with the government, our president, everything, how have you seen social media affect not only your work, but your peers as well?
In my particular area, I don't believe social media would have had any effect whatsoever. When you're dealing with factual, technical cases, they really aren't impacted by that. I can say from a litigation standpoint, just the dramatic change in technology has had a tremendous impact on how cases are handled. For example, when I started in tax litigation, I was doing briefs by dictating orally to my stenographer secretary, who took that down in shorthand and then typed it.
My mom's a stenographer, by the way.
Ah,
I
very
have to
good.
put that out there because she'll listen to this. So
But we had, we didn't have computers. We had law books. There was nothing to look up online. You had to know your way around a law library and how to get to the precedent, to the answers that you wanted. And boom, all of a sudden we're in the computer age, and the information could be much more readily found. So that really helped. But then what you had also was a proliferation of the use of technology to complicate the investigations and the fact-finding process. At one time, you could sit down, and most of my cases would have stipulated facts where parties agreed what the facts were. There was no dispute in the facts. It was, how does the law and the Constitution apply to these facts? So technology has had a tremendous effect. In my technical area, it would not have had, or social media would not have had any effect whatsoever. And I really don't think that really has that great of effect on the legal process. It can on the political process, as we see with the president's prolific use of social media of all kinds. But I think on the actual process of litigation, in most areas, it's not involved.
All right, well, that's going to be it for this episode of the Nightly News Podcast. We are going to say thank you very much to former Senior Deputy Attorney General John Butchar. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show as our political correspondent for the Nightly News.
It's my pleasure, Paul.
And, of course, Vice President Dylan Kleintop. Dylan, thank you very much for not only taking interest in this topic, but coming down here, asking a few questions, very important questions in this day and age.
thank you for having me.
All right, so for John Butchar, for Dylan Kleintop, this is Professor Paul Miller, and we'll catch you again next time on the Nightly News Podcast.